Imagine a developing nation that just completely disbanded its military, like
Rough.
took every single cent that would have gone toward tanks, artillery, fighter jets,
Right, the whole defense budget.
yeah, the whole thing. And they use that money instead to build rural schools, lay power lines out into the deep jungle, and fund universal health care.
It sounds like a utopian fiction, honestly.
It really does. But as a direct result of that one radical choice, its citizens now actually outlive Americans, and their entire national power grid runs on practically 100% green energy.
And, they transitioned from exporting basic crops like bananas to exporting complex microchips.
Exactly. So today we are taking a deep dive into the Costa Rican miracle.
And it is arguably the most fascinating, counterintuitive macroeconomic blueprint of the last 100 years. I mean, most countries spend centuries trying to navigate that transition from a developing agrarian society to a modern powerhouse.
Right, and historically that blueprint is incredibly dirty and highly militarized.
Oh, absolutely. It usually involves heavy industrialization, just massive carbon emissions to fuel cheap growth, and, heavily armed borders to protect that newly acquired wealth.
But Costa Rica just looked at that blueprint and completely threw it out the window.
They really did.
And that is exactly why today's deep dive is going to be so crucial. Welcome to our listener. Yes, you, the learner. We know you're always looking for those clear, really illuminating moments of insight without being overwhelmed by just a disorganized tsunami of information.
Right. Nobody wants that.
No. So today we have this highly customized, really exclusive exploration of a specific document created just for you. It's this dense, academically rigorous 15-page presentation.
And it analyzes the macroeconomic evolution of Costa Rica from 1960 all the way to 2024.
Yeah, and before we get into the numbers, I just have to describe this document to you, the learner, because the aesthetic is so striking.
It really sets the tone for the data.
It does. It's got these pure white backgrounds. The core visual on the cover page is this beautiful 2D abstract tree graph made entirely of data points.
Which perfectly symbolizes that green growth, right?
Exactly. And the whole thing is totally flat. No 3D gimmicks, no gradients, just this incredibly clean academic grid layout. They use these really specific colors too, like a deep, profound blue, a premium academic gray, and this dark forest green.
And they only use warning red for very specific data callouts. It forces you to focus entirely on the pure, distilled empiricism of the numbers.
Right, there is absolutely no marketing fluff here, just hard, verifiable World Bank and National Census data.
Tracking the actual lived reality of a nation over more than half a century.
So jumping into slide 2, the executive summary. The core thesis here is bold. It basically argues that Costa Rica has created a completely unique development paradigm.
Yeah, the visual here is great. It's this 2D radar chart, right? White background, gray lines, and this dark blue polygon stretching out to hit perfect scores across 4 dimensions.
Which are economic growth, universal health, clean energy, and tech adoption.
Right. And their foundational strategy to max out those dimensions was to eliminate their military budget entirely and funnel that freed-up national wealth, every single colon, their currency, into pushing human capital and green infrastructure to the absolute limit.
And what's fascinating here is how they achieved soaring GDP growth alongside this near-perfect clean energy record.
They effectively proved that a developing nation can leapfrog that dirty, heavy industry phase of modernization. Economists usually assume that's a mandatory stepping stone.
But, we are going to look at the entire picture today, because development is never a perfectly straight line, and the data we have isn't entirely perfect.
No, it never is.
There's actually this glaring, deeply rooted structural blind spot in Costa Rica's labor market, specifically regarding gender, that we'll unpack later on.
Yeah, that's on slide 14. It's a sobering data point.
It is. But before we get to the flaws, we have to start at the bedrock. We have to talk about the peace dividend.
You really cannot understand Costa Rica's economic trajectory without first understanding its defense policy. Or, well, its complete and total lack of one.
Right. Looking at slide 3 here, the visual is just this ultra-minimalist horizontal bar chart.
Yeah.
And they put this red dashed circle right around the 0 mark on the x-axis.
With a little call-out pointing to the half-century zero military miracle.
Exactly. The footnotes are incredibly explicit, they state. Costa Rica has no armed forces, period. Expenditure for paramilitary forces, border guard, and maritime and air surveillance is less than 0.05% of GDP.
0.05%.
That is a statistical zero.
It is. And to put the sheer magnitude of that into perspective for you, the listener, you have to consider what normal sovereign nations spend on defense.
Right, it's usually a massive chunk of change.
Oh, massive. Most countries allocate anywhere from 2 to 5%, and in highly contested regions, much more of their total GDP to their military.
Every single year.
Exactly. It's not a one-time cost. It's this astronomical, recurring annual drain on national wealth.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy because I want to make sure we really grasp the power of this over a long time horizon.
Sure, let's do it.
Think about it like personal finance. It's like taking the biggest, most stressful expense out of your household budget, say, a massive mortgage on a giant second home that you literally never use.
A total money pit.
Right. And taking 100% of that monthly payment and dumping it directly into a compounding index fund for your kids' college tuition, plus a gold-tier family healthcare plan.
Year after year, decade after decade.
Exactly. The compounding interest on that kind of social investment becomes absolutely staggering.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it. Because macroeconomics, when you stretch it out over a 60-year horizon, is fundamentally the study of compound interest.
Yeah.
And the narrative logic here completely upends traditional economic assumptions. Critics of strong social welfare states usually argue that massive government investments in health and education will inevitably drain the economy.
Right, that it requires crippling taxes, stifles the private sector.
Exactly. Yeah. But Costa Rica proves the exact opposite. And the reason they could do it without suffocating their economy with debt or taxes is precisely because they weren't also trying to fund a massive military apparatus.
They took that peace dividend and used it to build a highly robust, incredibly well-educated labor base.
And a healthy, educated population is the ultimate engine for long-term economic growth.
Which brings us right to slide 4. The economic baseline. The chart here is this nice 2D step area chart, and it's got this deep gray arrow just slicing upward through the area, showing this relentless growth.
Yeah, tracking their gross national income, or GNI per capita.
Right. Measured in current dollars, it starts at just a few $100 back in the 1960s, and it just relentlessly climbs until it crosses the $12,000 threshold in recent years.
And that upward GDP growth was sustained precisely because the workforce was capable of higher level productivity.
Because they invested in them.
Right. If you are a developing nation and you suddenly need engineers or doctors, you usually have to import them at great cost or send your elite abroad to study, hoping they come back.
Which they often don't.
Exactly, brain drain. But Costa Rica didn't have to import skilled labor. They built the infrastructure to generate it domestically.
But, you know, a rising GDP is only half the story.
True.
We've seen plenty of examples globally where a nation's GDP skyrockets. Maybe they discover massive oil reserves or something, but the wealth is entirely captured by a tiny elite.
And the average citizen stays trapped in grinding poverty.
Right. So the vital question for Costa Rica is, who actually gets to touch that money? Did the economic floor actually rise for the poorest citizens?
And that is the ultimate test of any development model. Does the macroeconomic data translate into actual measurable human dignity?
Well, looking at slide 5, the data on absolute poverty is genuinely dramatic. It's this 2D dual line chart in dark gray and navy blue, and it looks like a literal cliff.
Yeah, they use these red downward arrows at the end of the curves to really emphasize the drop.
Our data set measures absolute poverty using a very specific metric, the $3 a day threshold. And to be clear for the listener, this is adjusted for 2021 purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Which is a crucial distinction. We should briefly explain PPP for the listener.
Oh, please do.
Purchasing power parity isn't just taking $3 and looking at the raw currency exchange rate. It adjusts for the local cost of living. It measures what $3 can actually buy you in the local economy.
In terms of basic food, shelter, necessities.
Exactly. It's a measure of absolute baseline survival.
Right. And in the early days of this data set, an agonizing 33.5% of the Costa Rican population lived below that absolute poverty line.
Literally 1 in 3 people struggling to survive on $3 a day, which unfortunately was pretty typical for a developing agrarian nation in Latin America at the time.
But then, as the decades progress on this chart, that poverty headcount just plummets. It drops from 33.5% all the way down to a staggering 1.3%.
They practically wiped it out.
They really did. But the data gets even more nuanced here. It also tracks something called the poverty gap, at a slightly higher standard of $4.20 a day. And that gap plummeted from 22.4% down to just 0.8%.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the distinction between the poverty headcount and the poverty gap is one of the most important concepts in development economics.
Break down the mechanics of that for us. Why does the gap matter as much as the headcount?
Gladly. The poverty headcount is simply a binary metric. It asks a yes or no question, how many people are living below the line, but it doesn't tell you anything about how poor those people actually are.
Ah, okay.
Right.
Okay.
If the poverty line is set at $3, someone making $2.99 is counted exactly the same as someone making 10 cents a day.
But their lived reality is vastly different.
Exactly. The headcount treats them as identical. The poverty gap, on the other hand, measures severity. It calculates exactly how far below the poverty line the average poor person is living.
Okay, I think I get it.
Think of poverty like a deep, muddy pit. Lowering the headcount is like helping the people who are already near the top edge pull themselves out. But if a country drops its poverty headcount while its poverty gap remains high.
It means they've entirely abandoned the people trapped at the very bottom of the pit.
Precisely. They took the easy wins near the threshold, but ignored the deeply destitute.
But Costa Rica dropped both metrics to near zero, a 1.3% headcount and a 0.8% gap.
Which means they systematically built a ladder from the very bottom of the pit, lifting the absolute poorest, most marginalized people up with the rest of the economy.
It is a monumental achievement. It proves mathematically that the economic fruits actually reach the lowest rungs of society.
It proves that trickling down isn't a myth if the state aggressively directs its foundational wealth into public goods. If you let the wealth be consumed by military expenditures or elite capture, it never trickles down.
But you can't just hand people cash and expect a modern economy to miraculously blossom.
Right. You need infrastructure.
Exactly. Lifting people out of $3 a day poverty requires giving them the literal physical tools to participate in the 20th and 21st centuries. And the most literal tool, turning on the lights.
Which transitions us perfectly to slide 6, and one of the most astonishing logistical feats in modern history, Costa Rica's green infrastructure miracle.
I love the visual on this slide. It's a waffle chart, like a percentage fill chart, and they put a bold border around the squares representing the rural areas.
And the note there says, fixing the final shortfall, rural electricity hits 100%.
Yeah. The numbers tell a story of relentless expansion. Overall national electricity access went from 96.9% in 1990 to an absolutely flawless 100% in recent years. Every single person.
But that rural data point is the really critical one.
Going from 92.8% to a perfect 100, they completely bridged the gap.
We really need to pause and emphasize what that means in the real world. For almost any nation, urban areas are relatively easy to electrify.
Sure, putting a grid in a dense city is highly cost-effective.
Exactly. But the real nightmare for any developing nation is the rural hinterland. We are talking about deep, inaccessible jungles, isolated mountain ranges, remote farming communities.
Laying grid infrastructure to those areas is a logistical nightmare and incredibly expensive.
It is prohibitively expensive. From a pure, ruthless capitalist perspective, it yields a terrible return on investment, running miles of expensive copper wire over a mountain just to reach a village of 50 farmers.
A private utility company is never going to justify that cost.
Almost never. But Costa Rica did it anyway. And they didn't just string up some dirty...
diesel generators.
Exactly, diesel-powered microgrids. This is where the economic success story pivots into an ecological marvel.
Slide 7 shows their national energy network. It's an infographic pie chart. Most of it is this deep green representing hydroelectric power, a lighter green for other renewables, and then, well, there's no space for fossil fuels.
Because their renewable energy production sits at a staggering 99.36%.
It is almost entirely green. Hydroelectric is the absolute workhorse, providing roughly 70 to 75% of all their power.
And the rest is made up of other renewables like wind, geothermal energy tapped from their volcanoes, and solar.
But the data point that truly made me stop and stare is what they don't use. There's a literal line pointing to a 0% area on the chart that says, coal and natural gas electricity, 0%.
Let's let the weight of that sink in for you, the listener. We are talking about a rapidly developing, solidly middle-income nation that has achieved 100% electrification for every single citizen, and they're running that entire national grid on practically 100% green energy.
I have to play devil's advocate here because the skepticism is entirely natural.
Go for it.
When I hear that 75% of their power comes from hydro, my immediate cynical thought is, well, isn't that just geographical luck? I mean, they're in the tropics, they have massive mountains, heavy rainfall, powerful rivers.
They essentially hit the geographic lottery.
Right, of course they use hydro.
That is the single most common pushback you hear when discussing this model. And to be fair, it is partially true. Geography gave them the underlying potential. You cannot build a hydro dam without a river.
Right.
But geography is absolutely not destiny.
How so?
Because there are dozens of nations across the globe with massive river systems and incredible untapped hydroelectric potential in Central Africa, parts of South America, Southeast Asia, that had the exact same geographic advantages.
But they aren't fully green.
No. Many of these nations still rely heavily on importing expensive, dirty diesel generators burning coal, and their citizens still suffer from chronic rolling blackouts.
So having the river is really only step one.
Exactly. Having a rushing river doesn't automatically mean you possess the immense technical capacity to design a complex hydroelectric dam. And it certainly doesn't mean you have the state capacity to string thousands of miles of high-voltage lines through the jungle to reach peasant farmers.
Building a dam is a wildly expensive mega project.
It requires eye-watering, upfront capital investment. And the crucial question is, where did a poor agrarian nation in the mid-20th century find that kind of capital?
Oh man, it brings us right back to our first point. The peace dividend.
The military money.
Yeah.
Precisely. The billions of dollars that were not squandered on maintaining a standing army or buying weapons were instead deployed to capitalize their national utility companies.
It was a deliberate policy choice.
Very deliberate. They chose to harness their geographic luck for the universal public good rather than taking the easy route of importing cheap fossil fuels.
And the macroeconomic result of that policy choice is mapped out brilliantly on slide 8. It's this scatterline plot tracking the relationship between their GDP and their national carbon emissions.
And the visual shows this massive widening gap between the two. The lines completely diverge. They even put a dotted circle right at the crossover point labeled the perfect decoupling.
Decoupling. That's essentially the holy grail of modern sustainable development.
It absolutely is. Break down the old rule for us and how they broke it.
Well, for the last 200 years, the iron law of global economics has been, to get richer, a country must burn more dirty fuel. Economic growth and carbon emissions were physically linked. If your GDP went up, your coal consumption went up.
They moved in lockstep.
Exactly. But Costa Rica's data shows their GDP rising steeply, climbing into the middle income bracket, while their energy use per unit of GDP, their energy intensity actually fell. It dropped from 60.1 kilograms of oil equivalent down to 39.45.
Which means their economy is becoming vastly more energy efficient as it grows.
Yeah. And at the same time, their per capita CO2 emissions have remained practically at the floor, hovering around a mere 1.6 tons per person.
The ideological impact of this data cannot be overstated. For decades, the dominant argument has been that developing nations must be allowed a grace period to burn cheap fossil fuels.
The idea being that you can't pull millions out of poverty without the cheap energy provided by coal and gas.
Right. It was seen as a tragic but mandatory stepping stone. But Costa Rica completely obliterates that assumption. It proves empirically that a national grid can rely on clean energy to fuel high-speed economic growth.
So we have a country with money in its pockets, no military, no absolute poverty, and clean electricity in every single rural home. What does that specific environment do to the human body?
It creates a demographic miracle.
Slide 9 lays it out. It's a clean step chart with a bold horizontal reference line right at the 80-year mark. Back in 1960, the average Costa Rican could expect to live to about 63.4 years old.
Which was fairly standard.
Right. But today, the total population average has smashed right through that 80-year threshold. It sits at 80.4 years. And for women, it's even higher. They routinely hit 83.4 years.
This raises an important question for health economists. How does a nation with a GDP per capita of around $12,000 achieve first world life expectancies?
I mean, let's just say it. The average Costa Rican outlives the average American.
Yes, they do, despite the U.S. spending exponentially more per capita on healthcare.
It's wild. How do they do it?
The answer lies in the compounding effect of the policies we've been unpacking. Health isn't just about what happens inside a hospital when you're already sick. Health is largely environmental and preventative.
Ah, so it's the infrastructure.
Precisely. Because Costa Rica built a 100% green grid and refused to build coal plants, their ambient air quality is incredibly clean. respiratory diseases are suppressed.
And the rural electrification plays a huge part too.
Huge. Families in the deep jungle are no longer burning toxic biomass or kerosene inside poorly ventilated homes just to get light. That alone saves countless lungs.
Plus, electricity unlocks medical logistics.
Exactly. Electricity means widespread refrigeration. That means safe food storage and, crucially, the ability to store vaccines in remote rural clinics. It powers the pumps that provide clean drinking water, which practically eliminates waterborne diseases like cholera.
And you see the impact of that clean water in those clinics most dramatically at the beginning of life. Looking at slide 10, there's this waterfall chart tracking infant mortality.
The drop is breathtaking.
It goes from 70.9 deaths per 1,000 live births in 1960 down to just 7.7 today. The chart highlights the start and end points with dark circles and a line showing a drop of over 90%.
And that specific metric, infant mortality, is widely considered by demographers to be the ultimate unfakeable indicator of a functioning society.
Unfakeable. Why is that?
Because you can artificially inflate your GDP by exporting a single commodity like oil, right? You can hide vast wealth inequality behind averages, but you cannot fake a low infant mortality rate.
Babies are too fragile.
Exactly. Dropping that rate by over 90% means that the most vulnerable members of society are systematically protected. It implies a massive, highly coordinated system of prenatal care, clean water, and accessible local clinics.
And maternal mortality showed a similar plunge, down to roughly 24 deaths per 100,000 live births.
Which demonstrates a systemic commitment to women's health care. Keeping mothers alive stabilizes families and the future workforce.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The money saved from buying tanks was literally used to buy incubators.
A direct transfer of sovereign wealth from the machinery of war to the machinery of life.
But keeping the body alive is just one part. Slide 11 shifts to the mind, the human capital cornerstone, education.
And the data here is equally absolute.
It's a 100% bar chart, very stark, black and gray. And right near the full mark, there's a box highlighting a 99.1% youth literacy rate.
For 15 to 24-year-olds, practically universal.
And primary school completion for both boys and girls consistently floats between 90 and 100%. How does that literacy rate multiply the economy?
Think about the cascading benefits. When the state teaches a child to read, they aren't just imparting a technical skill, they are drastically reducing that person's future healthcare costs.
Because they can read a public health pamphlet.
Yes. They can understand sanitation protocols and accurately follow dosage instructions on medicine. Furthermore, widespread female literacy is the single most effective way to organically lower a nation's birth rate.
Because educated women enter the workforce later and have fewer, healthier kids.
Exactly. Yeah. And crucially, universal education prepares the population to actually participate in the global market.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot run a modern economy if your workers cannot read a manual.
Right. And once you have a highly educated, healthy, long-living population sitting in fully electrified homes, they don't just stay stagnant.
No, they connect to the world.
Which brings us to slide 12, leaping into the digital age. This chart is a smooth spline chart, and right after the year 2000, there's this steep tangent arrow pointing up, labeled the digital ignition point.
Internet usage skyrockets from 0 to over 85% of the population.
And mobile cellular subscriptions exploded to 179 per 100 people, meaning many people have multiple active devices.
The integration of communication technology into daily life is absolute. And the fascinating part is what they did with that connectivity.
Which is mapped out on slide 13. It's a vertical bar chart overlaying a line graph, a Pareto-style chart.
Yeah.
Now, historically, when you think of exports from Central America, what comes to mind?
Bananas, coffee, sugar, the classic profile of a developing tropical nation.
Right, primary agricultural products. But relying on those is a trap.
A massive economic vulnerability. When your wealth depends on coffee beans, you're at the mercy of things you can't control. Weather, pests, commodity price crashes.
But Costa Rica didn't stay a fruit exporter. The chart shows a deliberate pivot. High-tech products as a share of their manufacturing exports peaked at over 77.9%.
That's incredible.
And information and communication technology ICT goods reached over 30% of total exports. They shifted from bananas to complex microchips and advanced digital services.
And how does a small tropical nation do that? The mechanism is foreign direct investment, FDI.
Meaning multinational corporations choosing to build factories there, like Intel, right?
Exactly. When these megacorporations evaluate a developing nation for a multi-billion-dollar plant, They look for three non-negotiable requirements. And cheap labor is not the top priority.
Because cheap labor is useless if the factory keeps getting shut down.
Right. Number one, absolute political stability. They cannot risk building a semiconductor plant in a country prone to military coups.
The,
By abolishing its military in 1948, Costa Rica inherently stabilized its democracy. No army to overthrow the government.
the peace dividend strikes again. What's the second requirement?
A highly educated, trainable workforce. You cannot manufacture precision medical equipment with an illiterate workforce. Costa Rica's 99% youth literacy rate guaranteed a ready-made labor pool.
And the third requirement.
Absolute reliability and infrastructure. Uninterrupted power. A microchip plant cannot tolerate a rolling blackout. It ruins millions of dollars of silicon in seconds.
Plus, those tech companies love green power for their own climate goals.
Exactly. Costa Rica offered a 100% reliable, 100% green national grid. The foundation they started building in the 60s acted as the ultimate launch pad for the tech sector.
It's an unbelievable story of long-term strategic patience.
There's always a bet.
Yeah. It sounds like a flawless utopia so far. But the academic nature of this presentation demands we don't just cherry-pick the highlights. Data doesn't care about our narratives.
Objective scrutiny demands we look at where this paradigm is failing. National development is never a finished project.
Which brings us to slide 14, the blind spot, the labor market gender gap.
The statistics here are incredibly stubborn.
The visual is a dumbbell plot, and it highlights this stark, unchanging gap of about 30% between men and women in labor force participation. Male participation is robust, over 70%.
But female participation is completely stagnated between 40 and 45%. It refuses to budge. And female unemployment is persistently higher.
What's most striking is the structural paradox it reveals. Think back to the human capital data.
Right, women outlive men. They have universal health care, exact same near 100% primary school completion and literacy rates.
The state invested billions to create this incredibly capable female population, but the labor market is completely failing to absorb them. It's a massive misallocation of talent.
It highlights a crucial lesson. Brilliant macroeconomic policy can build schools and green grids, but it cannot automatically erase deep-seated cultural norms or structural barriers to employment.
Like what kind of barriers?
Usually it's rooted in an uneven burden of unpaid domestic care, a lack of affordable childcare, inflexible corporate cultures, or systemic biases in the tech and engineering sectors we were just praising.
It's a profound irony. A country so radically progressive that they deleted their army and decoupled from carbon, yet they wrestle with the exact same traditional gender disparities as an unmodernized economy.
It's a sobering reminder to the listener that the Costa Rican paradigm isn't a magical utopia. It's a messy, real-world experiment. Their next great frontier is integrating that missing 30% into the high-tech economy.
Wow. Okay, so to bring this massive journey all together, we look at slide 15, the conclusion. It's this flat 2D conceptual architecture map showing 4 foundational pillars converging into a central circle labeled high-quality development in harmony with humanity and nature.
And those 4 pillars are exactly what we've unpacked. Zero military, 100% green electricity, heavy education investment, and universal health care.
If we synthesize this, the ultimate message is that breaking out of the poverty trap does not require a massive military or a century of choking on coal smoke.
It requires aligning every cent of your national spending with human well-being and ecological balance.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to pose directly to you, the learner. Think about the sheer scale of what we've just explored. Costa Rica made an incredibly dangerous choice back in 1948. They entirely deleted the concept of defense spending. They bet literally their entire sovereign wealth on human spending.
A monumental risk that paid off.
So as you process this data, think about your own country's national budget, or scale it down, your corporate budget, your household budget. If a developing nation could achieve this level of high-tech green prosperity by divesting entirely from a military, what is the untouchable expense in our own modern societies?
Oh, that's a great question.
What is that massive assumed cost that we believe we absolutely must pay for, that we are too afraid to cut, but which might actually be the very thing holding us back from making our own evolutionary leap?
That is a deeply challenging question to leave on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into your personalized data presentation. Keep questioning the numbers, keep exploring the mechanisms behind the stats, and we'll see you next time.